Welcome to the Learning Center. Today we're going to be going over bloodborne pathogen training. OSHA's goal is to promote and enforce worker safety and health in every workplace in the United States. OSHA's bloodborne pathogen standard protects employees who work in occupations where they are at risk of exposure to blood or other potentially infectious materials. OSHA's hazard communication standard protects employees who may also be exposed to hazardous chemicals. Both standards require employers to develop written documents to explain how they will implement each standard, provide training to the employees, and protect the health and safety of their workers. All employees will utilize the universal precautions. Employees covered by the bloodborne pathogen standard receive an explanation of this ECP or exposure control plan during their initial training session. It will also be reviewed in their annual refresher training. If requested, we will provide an employee with a copy of the ECP free of charge and within 15 days of the request. The responsible person or department is responsible for reviewing and updating the ECP annually or more frequently if necessary to reflect any new or modified tasks and procedures that affect occupational exposure and to reflect new or revised employee positions with occupational exposure. Engineering controls and work practice controls will be used to prevent or minimize exposure to bloodborne pathogens. The specific engineering controls and work practice controls used are listed below. For example, non-glass capillary tubes, SCSIPs, and needleless systems. Sharps disposal containers are inspected and maintained or replaced by the government agency's trained medical staff. Mavaji employees are in no way responsible for the task of handling sharps containers and should only notify the appropriate party if attention is needed for this task, whenever necessary to prevent overfilling. Personal protective equipment is provided to our employees at no cost to them. The types of personal protective equipment available to employees are as follows, such as gloves, eye protection, and masks. Your immediate supervisor or project manager may obtain the minimum items to be used. All employees using personal protective equipment must observe the following precautions. Wash hands immediately or as soon as feasible after removing gloves or other equipment. Remove the equipment after it becomes contaminated and before leaving the work area. Used equipment may be disposed of in containers of storage, laundering, decontamination, or disposal. Wear appropriate gloves when it is reasonably anticipated that there may be hand contact with blood or OPIN, and when handling or touching contaminated items or surfaces. Replace gloves if torn, punctured, or contaminated, or if they lose their ability to function as a barrier if compromised. Utility gloves may be contaminated for reuse if their integrity is not compromised. Discard utility gloves if they show signs of cracking, peeling, tearing, puncturing, or deterioration. Never wash or decontaminate disposable gloves for reuse. Wear appropriate face and eye protection when splashes, sprays, spatters, or droplets of blood or OPIN pose a hazard to the eye, nose, or mouth. Remove immediately or as soon as feasible any garment contaminated by blood or OPIN in such a way as to avoid contact with the outer surface. Refer to the safety handbook section of personal protective equipment for more specific details. Regulated waste is placed in containers that are closable, constructed to contain all contents and prevent leakage, appropriately labeled or color-coded, and closed prior to removal to prevent spillage or protrusion of contents during handling. Contaminated sharp objects are discarded immediately or as soon as possible in containers that are closable, puncture-resistant, leak-proof on sides and bottoms, and appropriately labeled or color-coded. Sharps disposable containers must be easily accessible and as close as feasible to the immediate area where sharps are used. Bins and pails, such as wash and emesis basins, are cleaned and decontaminated as soon as feasible after visible contamination. Broken glassware, debris on the floor, or anything else that may be contaminated is only picked up using mechanical means, such as a brush or dustpan. Never use your fingers or hands, as this may expose you to hidden sharps. Following contaminated items will be laundered by this company: mop heads and cleaning cloths. Laundering will be performed by a designated person at each contract in the frequency deemed necessary to avoid the excess collection of soiled items and to assure proper knowledge of handling contaminated items. The following laundering requirements must be met. Handle contaminated laundry as little as possible, with minimal agitation. Place wet, contaminated laundry in leak-proof, labeled, or color-coded containers before transport. Use either red bags or bags marked with the biohazard symbol for this purpose. Wear the following equipment when handling and/or sorting contaminated laundry: protective disposable gloves, smocks or protective aprons as needed. The project manager will provide training to employees on hepatitis B vaccinations, addressing safety, benefits, efficacy, methods of administration, and availability. The Hepatitis B vaccination series is available at no cost after initial employee training and within 10 days of initial assignment to all employees identified in the exposure determination section of this plan. Vaccination is encouraged unless documentation exists that the employee has previously received this series, antibody testing reveals that the employee is immune, or medical evaluation shows that the vaccination is contraindicated. However, if an employee declines the vaccination, the employee must sign a declination form. Employees who decline may request and obtain the vaccination at a later date at no cost. Documentation of vaccination refusal is kept at the corporate office in the employee personnel file. Vaccinations will be provided by approved and contracted healthcare facility local for each contract. Following the medical evaluation, a copy of the healthcare professional's written opinion will be obtained and provided to the employee within 15 days of the completion of the evaluation. It will be limited to whether the employee requires the hepatitis vaccination and whether the vaccination was administered. Should an exposure incident occur, contact your project manager in the corporate office to provide details of the incident and to provide contact information for a follow-up call from the contract administrator. An immediately available confidential medical evaluation and follow-up will be conducted by the contracted licensed healthcare professional or facility local up to each contract. Following first initial aid, clean the wound, flush the eyes or other mucous membranes. The following activities will be performed. Document the routes of exposure and how the exposure occurred. Identify and document the source individual, unless the employer can establish that identification is infeasible or prohibited by state or local law. Obtain consent and make arrangements to have the source individual tested as soon as possible to determine HIV, HCV, and HBV infectivity. Document that the source individual's test results were conveyed to the employee's health provider. Project manager or contract administrator ensures that healthcare professionals are responsible for employees' hepatitis B vaccination, the post-exposure evaluation, and follow-up are given a copy of OSHA's Bloodborne Pathogen Standard. The project manager or contract administrator ensures that the healthcare professional evaluating an employee after an exposure incident receives the following: description of the employee's job duties relevant to the exposure incident, route of exposure, circumstances of exposure, if possible, the results of the source individual's blood test, relevant employee medical records, including vaccination status. Project manager or contract administrator provides the employee with a copy of the evaluating healthcare professional's written opinion within 15 days after completion of the evaluation. If the source individual is already known to be HIV, HCV, or HBV positive, new testing need not be performed. Ensure that the exposed employee is provided with the source individual's test results and with information about applicable disclosure laws and regulation concerning the identity and infectious status of the source individual. After obtaining consent, collect the exposed employee's blood as soon as possible after the exposure incident and test blood for HBV and HIV serological status. If the employee does not give consent for HIV serological testing during the collection of blood for baseline testing, Request that the baseline blood sample be preserved for at least 90 days. The exposed employee elects to have the baseline sample tested during this waiting period. Perform testing as soon as possible. The project manager or contract administrator will review the circumstances of all exposure incidents to determine engineering controls in use at the time. Work practice as followed: description of the device being used, including type and brand, protective equipment or clothing that was used at the time of the exposure incident, location of the incident, procedure being performed when the incident occurred, and employee training. Project manager or contract administrator will record all injuries from contaminated sharps in a sharps injury log. If revisions to this ECP are necessary, the project manager or contract administrator will ensure that the appropriate changes are made. All employees who have occupational exposure to bloodborne pathogens receive initial and annual training conducted by the project manager or supervisor. All employees who have occupational exposure to bloodborne pathogens receive training on the epidemiology, symptoms, and the transmission of bloodborne pathogen diseases. In addition, the training program covers at a minimum the following elements: copy and explanation of the OSHA bloodborne pathogen standard, an explanation of our ECP and how to obtain a copy, an explanation of methods to recognize tasks and other activities that may involve exposure to blood, and OPIM, including what constitutes an exposure incident, an explanation of the use and limitations of engineering controls, work practices, and personal protective equipment, an explanation of the types, use, location, removal, handling, decontamination, and disposal of equipment, an explanation of the basis for equipment selection, information on the hepatitis B vaccination, including information on its efficacy, safety, method of administration, benefits of being vaccinated, and that the vaccine will be offered free of charge. Information on the appropriate actions to take and the persons to contact in an emergency involving blood or OPI. Explanation of the procedure to follow if an exposure incident occurs, including the method of reporting the incident and the medical follow-up that will be made available. Information on the post-exposure evaluation and follow-up that the employer is required to provide for the employee following an exposure incident. An explanation of the signs and labels and/or color coding required by the standard and use at the facility. An opportunity for interactive questions and answers with the person conducting the training session. Training records are completed for each employee upon completion of training. These documents will be kept for at least 3 years at the corporate office with personal records. The training records include the dates of the training sessions, contents or a summary of the training sessions, names and qualifications of persons conducting the training, names and job titles of all persons attending the training sessions. Employee training records are provided upon request to the employee or the employee's authorized representative within 15 working days. Such requests should be addressed to the contract project manager or the corporate HR department. Medical records are maintained for each employee with occupational exposure in accordance with 29 CFR 1910.1020, access to employee exposure and medical records. Contract administrator or corporate HR is responsible for the maintenance of the required medical records. These confidential records are maintained for at least the duration of employment plus 30 years. Employee medical records are provided upon request of the employee or to anyone having written consent of the employee within 15 working days. Such requests should be sent to Mabaji's corporate office HR management. In addition to the 1904 record-keeping requirements, all injuries from contaminated sharps are also recorded in the sharps injury log. All incidents must include at least the date of the injury, the type and brand of the device involved, such as a syringe, suture, or needle, department or work area where the incident occurred, and the explanation of how the incident occurred. This log is reviewed as part of the annual program evaluation and maintained for at least 5 years following the end of the calendar year covered. If a copy is requested by anyone, it must have any personal identifiers removed from the report. Thank you for joining us on this Learning Center presentation.